The day had dawned with a kind of sullen civility, as if the clouds over St. Mildred's parish in the village of Lillingham were too polite to rain outright, yet too burdened to allow the sun to break through. By noon, the entire village had gathered, dressed in their best dark attire, at the modest stone church at the top of the hill. They had come to say goodbye to Geoffrey Lonscombe, retired solicitor, committee chair of the village cricket club, and, as most would politely say, a man of firm opinion. Heart gave out in his sleep, Reverend Pritchard had said gently to Mrs. Templeton, the church organist, who had repeated it at least 6 times between then and the moment she pressed her gloved fingers to the first note of Abide With Me. The late Mr. Lonscombe had been well into his 70s and was, by most accounts, not widely liked, but broadly respected. That is to say, no one expected his funeral to be eventful. Yet just as the final hymn ended and the pallbearers shifted to carry the casket toward the graveyard path, the interruption came. A strange sound echoed from outside. Boots, on gravel, quick and deliberate. The heavy oak doors of the church groaned open with theatrical reluctance, and in the entrance stood a pale, panting young woman in a damp riding coat, curls escaping her hat, her face streaked with tears and rain. "Stop! You must stop the funeral," she cried. He can't be buried! Geoffrey Lonscombe was murdered!" A gasp ran through the congregation like wind through dry leaves. Mrs. Berry from the bakery audibly dropped her hymnal. The vicar stammered something inaudible. From her place at the rear of the church, Miss Marple, who had been quietly observing the crowd and mouthing the hymns with reserved devotion, raised one silver eyebrow. She did not gasp, nor lean forward, like the others. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, the way a bird does when it detects movement in the underbrush. The young woman, unknown to most, was quickly identified as Miss Eliza Drake, Geoffrey Lonscombe's ward, returned from a term abroad in Paris and not expected home for another fortnight. She collapsed into one of the pews, breathless, insisting between sobs that she had evidence, letters, a document and more, that proved her guardian's death had been no mere failure of the heart. Constable Nettle, who had taken his place near the doors mostly for appearance's sake, now sprang into action with an expression that suggested he would much rather be asked to carry the coffin than face what now lay ahead. Let's clear the church for now," he stammered, exchanging a worried glance with Reverend Pritchard. "Funerals postponed." And just like that, the mourners filed out in murmuring waves, clumps of villagers forming immediately outside as speculation bloomed like mould in a pantry. Miss Marple stepped outside last, moving with a slight limp and steady grace. She neither hurried nor lingered, but walked as one accustomed to letting the world move around her. She passed Mrs. Peveril, who whispered behind a veiled hand to the town's apothecary's wife, and Mr. Denholm, who muttered something about Parisian dramatics and women's nerves. They were all wrong, of course. But then, most people often were. Miss Marple paused under the budding lilac tree by the gate, looking back once at the open church doors. Funerals, she reflected, rarely come too early. But justice, that was another matter entirely. And with that, she took out a handkerchief, dabbed lightly at her lips, and began the short walk back to her cottage, her knitting still waiting on the arm of her favourite chair, and her mind already sorting through the peculiar puzzle that had only just begun to unfold. Miss Marple reached her gate just as the clouds gave in, and a light misting rain began to fall, soaking the hedgerows and drawing up the earthy scent of damp leaves. She paused to remove her gloves, brown kid leather, worn but well kept, and tucked them neatly into her handbag. She looked once over her shoulder toward the church, still surrounded by clusters of villagers, their voices low and excited, eyes flicking this way and that. Eliza Drake's sudden accusation had landed like a stone dropped in still water, sharp, sudden, and impossible to ignore. Back inside her cottage, she set the kettle to boil and settled in her chair by the window. The knitting sat untouched. Her needles remained still. Her gaze was fixed on the lane. Few things in life were truly shocking to Jane Marple, and fewer still were entirely unprecedented. In her experience, the unexpected often followed an all-too-predictable rhythm. Human emotions laid bare under pressure, secrets rising like cream to the surface. The kettle whistled. She poured the tea with precision, added a thin curl of lemon, and waited. She didn't have to wait long. Barely an hour had passed when a knock came, sharp and agitated. It was Mrs. Emmeline Carter, breathless and pink from her uphill walk, her umbrella streaming water onto Miss Marple's mat. "I've only just heard, Jane," she said, slipping inside before Miss Marple could say a word. "The girl, Geoffrey's ward, Eliza, is claiming he was murdered. Can you imagine?" "Yes, dear," said Miss Marple mildly, offering her a cup. "It's all rather dreadful. Though funerals do have a way of revealing things people would rather keep buried. 1 lump or 2? 2, please." Mrs. Carter sank into the floral armchair with the air of someone accepting a challenge. "Do you believe it?" "Murder, I mean." Miss Marple stirred the tea thoughtfully. "Well, Geoffrey was not a man many would have gone out of their way to save, let us say that. But as to murder—" She let the sentence trail off, leaving the silence to do its work. Mrs. Carter, predictably, rushed to fill it. "I always said he was too involved in other people's business. Remember the row he had with the Chambers? Boy about that boundary wall, or the time he accused young Mrs. Templeton of doctoring the cricket club accounts. He didn't make friends, Jane." "No," said Miss Marple softly, "but enemies do tend to make themselves, don't they?" That night, the rain deepened into a proper storm, and Lillingham hunkered in, windows shuttered, curtains drawn. But the news had already flown, riding, on the wings of speculation and gossip, crossing parlour thresholds and pub stools with equal ease. By morning, the entire village was abuzz. At the police station, which was little more than 2 modest rooms behind the post office, Constable Nettle had his hands full. Eliza Drake had returned with a small leather case, which he opened with trembling fingers before him and Inspector Cray, who had been summoned from East Melford. Inside were 3 letters, all in Lonscombe's sharp legal hand. The first was addressed to Eliza herself and expressed concern over irregularities in his affairs. The second was a draft of a new will, unsigned but clearly naming Eliza as sole heir, replacing the previously favoured cousin, Cecil Grange. And the third, most damning of all, was a letter to a solicitor in London requesting immediate review of a trust fund, with the cryptic line, "I believe someone has been helping themselves under my very nose." Inspector Cray read it twice. "Miss Drake, how did you come by these?" "They were in a drawer in my guardian's study," she said, "in a compartment he once told me never to open. He kept the key behind a loose tile in the fireplace." Cray raised his brows. "And you thought to look there. Why?" "Because," she said simply, "he knew something. He wrote to me last week, urging me to come home. Said it was urgent. I took the first train I could." Cray nodded slowly. Well, Miss Drake, this changes things. For now, the burial's on hold, and Mr. Lonscombe's body will be examined. Eliza paled but nodded. Outside, the gossip gained fuel. People clutched at names like pebbles on a beach, passing them from hand to hand, weighing their guilt. Cecil Grange, of course, was first, on everyone's lips. A bachelor of 52, always impeccably dressed, always hovering at the edge of village events. He had depended on Geoffrey Lonscombe for both financial advice and, it was whispered, the occasional discreet loan. Losing his place in the will would be both embarrassing and ruinous. Then there was Alice Brent, the nurse companion who had tended Geoffrey for the past 6 months. A widow with a warm smile and a reputation for keeping confidences. Too well, some said. She'd been overheard arguing with Lonscombe not a week before his death, in the garden behind the house. Loud words. Something about promises. Miss Marple listened to all of this with her usual expression of polite interest and her usual lack of firm opinion. By the second afternoon, Inspector Cray called on her. Miss Marple, he began, standing awkwardly in her sitting room with his cap in his hands. You've a certain reputation for noticing things. You knew Mr. Lonscombe, I gather? Oh, yes. We served together on the village committee for the flower show. He always disqualified begonias if they showed any hint of artificial support. Very particular about rules. Would you say he had any enemies? She smiled gently. Oh, Inspector. In villages, one doesn't have enemies. One has people who remember things. A snub, a disagreement, a rumour never quite forgotten. All tucked away like old receipts. Cray sighed. And the girl, Eliza Drake. Do you trust her? Trust. Miss Marple repeated. That's a very strong word. Let's just say she is sincere. But sincerity can walk hand in hand with misdirection, sometimes without knowing it. He frowned. I see. After he left, Miss Marple sat a while longer. At her window, her fingers moving at last over her knitting. A small frown furrowed her brow. A new will, unsigned. A secret letter. A death at night with no witnesses. Too neat. Too convenient. And Miss Eliza Drake, with her well-timed return and her dramatic interruption, was she really just a concerned ward? Or had she known the letters would be there? Or perhaps, had someone made sure she found them? Miss Marple laid down the knitting and reached for her notebook, not for names. No, she didn't need those yet. But she jotted a phrase that had come to her, something a young woman in another village had once said, after a similarly unexpected death. Only the guilty worry about timing. Yes, the funeral had been disrupted, but the question was, who had wanted it to be and why? The rain stopped, and the sky broke open with a dull yellow light. Another funeral might be delayed, but the truth, Miss Marple knew, had a way of insisting on its own resurrection. She looked out across the rooftops of Lillingham and saw not peace, but the slow stirring of secrets. The next move, she knew, would belong to someone else, and she was ready to watch it. The following morning dawned clear and crisp, with a sun that seemed to promise a swift drying of the muddy lanes and soggy hedgerows. The village of Lillingham had already begun to shake off the lingering fog of shock and confusion brought on by the interrupted funeral. But beneath the polite facades and morning greetings, the tension was palpable. Conversations hummed in corners of the village shop and drifted through the open windows of the Red Lion, where the regulars speculated on every whispered word and half-seen glance. Miss Marple, for her part, had already begun her own quiet inquiries, though she bore no badge or authority beyond the respect earned by years of keen observation and an uncanny knack for understanding human nature. She found that her reputation preceded her enough to allow access to certain confidences, but never so much that she intimidated or unsettled those she spoke to. Her first visit was to the Lonscombe residence, a modest but dignified cottage on the edge of the village, where Eliza Drake now stayed under the watchful eyes of Mrs. Brent, the nurse. The house was quiet except for the faint murmur of voices upstairs. Miss Marple was greeted by Alice Brent herself, who appeared composed though her eyes betrayed a trace of weariness. "Thank you for seeing me, Mrs. Brent," Miss Marple began, as they settled in the sitting-room, the scent of fresh lavender mingling with the faint undertones of antiseptic. "I hope you don't mind my calling at such a time." "Not at all, Miss Marple. We all need someone steady to talk to," Mrs. Brent replied, smoothing the front of her neat apron. "I understand Mr. Lonscombe was quite a determined man." "You've been with him for some months?" "Yes, just over 6. He was a hard man, too, pleased but not unkind. Especially once he knew you understood the value of discretion." She glanced briefly out the window before continuing in a quieter tone. "But in these last weeks he seemed more troubled, restless, even when he should have been resting. I overheard him on the phone, angry, worried about something or someone." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Did he mention names?" "No, but it was serious. I found a letter once, half shoved in the wastepaper basket, but it was too late. I didn't want to pry." "That's very wise." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Sometimes the smallest things reveal the greatest truths." Mrs. Brent hesitated, then lowered her voice. "He also seemed uneasy about Eliza. He wanted to protect her from something, though he wouldn't say what. I do worry the poor girl is caught in something beyond her." Before Miss Marple could ask more, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed from the hall. Eliza Drake entered, looking less composed than before, her cheeks flushed, her eyes bright but shadowed. "Miss Marple, I'm so grateful you came," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of relief and anxiety. "There's so much. I don't understand. Geoffrey was like a father to me, and now I fear his death was no accident." Miss Marple studied her quietly. Eliza was young, with an earnestness that bordered on desperation, but also something guarded beneath the surface, something that told Miss Marple she was not revealing everything just yet. "Tell me everything from the beginning, dear," Miss Marple said gently. "Sometimes the story reveals itself when we least expect." Eliza took a deep breath. "It started after I returned from Paris. Geoffrey called me almost immediately. He said there was something urgent I had to see, something in his papers that could change everything. But before I arrived, I found the house changed. His secretary, Mrs. Holloway, was gone. And then, the night before his death, I overheard a conversation, Geoffrey arguing with someone on the phone. He said, if this comes out, everything is ruined." Miss Marple's fingers tightened on her teacup. "Did you catch the other voice?" "No," Eliza whispered. "But it sounded angry, threatening even." They spoke for a while longer, piecing together the fragments of Geoffrey's last days, when there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Brent answered it to reveal Inspector Cray, his expression grim but courteous. "Miss Marple, if I may interrupt." he began, stepping inside and surveying the room. "We've received the preliminary report from the medical examiner." Eliza and Mrs. Brent exchanged anxious glances, and Miss Marple inclined her head for Cray to continue. "It appears Geoffrey Lonscombe's death was caused not by natural causes, but by a slow-acting poison," Cray said. "Not enough to be immediately obvious, but enough to cause his heart to fail. We're still investigating the source, but this confirms what Miss Drake suggested." A cold silence filled the room. Eliza's hand flew to her mouth, and Mrs. Brent looked away. Miss Marple's mind was already racing through the implications. Poisoning was a careful, deliberate crime. It required knowledge, opportunity, and motive. But who among the village had all three? "Thank you for sharing this, Inspector. It is a grave development," she said softly. "Do you have any suspects?" Cray shook his head. "Nothing concrete yet. We're questioning everyone who had access to Mr. Lonscombe in the days before his death. But I imagine you may have some insight." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I am no professional, but I do listen closely. Sometimes what is not said tells more than what is." The inspector gave a wry smile. "We could all use a bit more of that." As Cray left, Miss Marple rose and walked to the window, looking out over the village now stirring with fresh rumours. She noted the faces of passers-by, some open, some guarded. The poison was not just in Geoffrey's veins, but seemingly infused in the very air of Lillingham. Her thoughts returned to Cecil Grange, who was sure to be scrutinised closely given his sudden loss in the will. She recalled the whispered tales of his financial troubles, the bitter arguments he had with Geoffrey, and the way he had been seen lurking near the Lonscombe house the night before the funeral. But there was also Mrs. Peveril, the apothecary's wife, who had access to a wide range of remedies and tinctures, and Alice Brent, whose close attendance might have provided opportunity. Even Eliza herself was a puzzle. Her arrival was too well-timed, her knowledge too precise. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Poison, after all, was a weapon wielded best by those who understood subtlety and patience. It was not the act of a reckless man or woman, but of someone who wished to hide behind appearances. Later that day, Miss Marple made her way to the village shop where the postmistress, Mrs. Haggerty, was known for her keen ear and sharper tongue. As she stepped inside, the scent of freshly baked bread and the faint musk of old paper greeted her. "Jane," Mrs. Haggerty called, setting aside a package wrapped in brown paper. "I heard about poor Geoffrey. Shocking, simply shocking." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, selecting a basket for her errands. "Have you heard any whispers that might help an old friend untangle this mess?" Mrs. Haggerty leaned in, lowering her voice. "Well, there's talk that Cecil Grange has been seen paying visits to a stranger in the neighbouring village, a man known for less than legal dealings. Could be blackmail or worse." Miss Marple nodded slowly, adding the information to her mental ledger. Blackmail would certainly provide motive. "Anything else?" she asked. "Some say Eliza has been too quick to claim her inheritance. Folks wonder if she knew more about Geoffrey's troubles than she lets on. And then there's the matter of the missing secretary, Mrs. Holloway. No one's seen her since the week before the funeral." "Interesting," Miss Marple murmured. Missing persons often hold keys to hidden doors. As she left the shop, the village's winding streets felt suddenly narrower, the shadows longer. Every face she passed was a story, every whispered word a clue. That evening, as twilight settled over Lillingham, Miss Marple sat once again by her window, a small collection of notes and letters spread on the table before her. She revisited the letters Eliza had shown the inspector, her eyes lingering on the phrases Geoffrey had chosen with such care. Her thoughts circled around one question. If Geoffrey had been aware of a threat, why had he waited so long to act? And who had so deeply wished to silence him that they resorted to poison, delivered so subtly it mimicked natural death? Her quiet cottage felt colder than before, and as the village settled into uneasy sleep, Miss Marple knew that beneath the gentle surface of Lillingham lay a tangled web of secrets. She would need patience, tact, and her sharpest observations to unravel them. For now, the game was afoot, and the players were assembling, and Miss Marple was watching. The morning after the medical examiner's report, the village of Lillingham wore a mask of quiet civility, but underneath, the currents of suspicion churned more restlessly than ever. Miss Marple, having spent a restless night contemplating the subtle clues, resolved to visit a few key figures in person. The day was crisp but clear, and the light revealed every detail, the faintest footprints, a glance exchanged too quickly, the hesitation in a voice. Her first call was to Cecil Grange's residence, a tidy but sombre red-brick house just beyond the village green. Cecil opened the door with a weary expression that failed to mask his annoyance. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice cool but courteous. "I suppose I should expect visits now. Everyone thinks I had something to gain from Geoffrey's death." Miss Marple stepped inside without waiting for invitation. "People often suspect what they most fear to admit themselves, Mr. Grange. But I am more interested in facts than fears." Cecil folded his hands, sitting opposite her in the drawing room, where a fire burned low. "I was home all night when Geoffrey died. My servants will confirm it, and I had no reason to kill him. Yes, I lost my place in the will, but he never made enemies without cause. Besides, I'm trying to rebuild, not ruin myself." "True," Miss Marple agreed, "but money is a powerful motivator. Tell me, Cecil, did you know anything about Geoffrey's new will?" I'd heard whispers, but no details. It was a shock to us all, especially that Eliza Drake was named heir. I don't trust her. Miss Marple noticed the flicker of something, sharper in his eyes. "Why not?" "Because she's young and suddenly very interested in his affairs. Some say she came back just in time to claim what she thought was hers. Timing is suspicious, don't you think?" "I do wonder about timing," Miss Marple said softly. "But the question is, did she know more than she said? Or was she herself manipulated?" Cecil shook his head impatiently. "I'm done defending myself to the village. They'd rather believe a scandal than the truth." Miss Marple stood to leave but paused. "Mr. Grange, I've heard rumours that you've been meeting with a stranger from East Melford. Care to explain?" Cecil's eyes narrowed. "That's none of your business." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Sometimes the most dangerous secrets are the ones people refuse to share." Her next visit was to Mrs. Peveril, the apothecary's wife, who lived above the village shop. Mrs. Peveril was known for her sharp tongue and keen knowledge of herbs and remedies. She welcomed Miss Marple with a raised eyebrow and a cup of strong tea. "Jane, what brings you here on such a fine morning?" she asked, setting down the teacup. "Curiosity, mostly," Miss Marple replied. "You have access to many substances, Mrs. Peveril. I wonder if you've noticed anything unusual recently." Mrs. Peveril's smile faltered just slightly. "Curiosity killed the cat, Jane, as you well know. But no, nothing out of the ordinary. People come and go, and I'm busy with my customers." Miss Marple watched her carefully. "You knew Geoffrey?" "Well, to a degree. He came for various tinctures and ointments. He was a stubborn man, more interested in his own remedies than conventional advice." "Did he ever express concern about his health?" "Lately, yes. He was worried about his heart, claimed he felt faint, though he never told me outright. Said he was afraid something was wrong with his medicines." Miss Marple's interest deepened. "Did he mention any disagreements over his prescriptions or treatments?" Mrs. Peveril shrugged. "No, but you know how patients can be. Always suspicious. Always thinking someone wants to poison them." The mention of poison hung in the air between them like a shadow. Leaving Mrs. Peveril, Miss Marple made her way toward the edge of the village, where the riverbank twisted quietly beneath the trees. Here she hoped to find Mrs. Holloway, Geoffrey's missing secretary. The woman had vanished without trace, and Miss Marple suspected her disappearance might be more than mere coincidence. At the small riverside cottage, an elderly woman named Mrs. Jenkins answered the door. "Mrs. Holloway, no one's seen her. In weeks. She left suddenly, they say. Took little with her." "Do you know why?" Miss Marple inquired. Mrs. Jenkins shrugged. "Can't say for sure. There was talk she'd found something troubling in Geoffrey's papers. Some said she was frightened." That was a lead worth following. On her way back, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Alice Brent. The nurse's devotion seemed genuine, but Miss Marple knew that appearances could deceive. She recalled overhearing Alice's argument with Geoffrey in the garden, the loud words and sudden silences. Later that afternoon she called on Mrs. Brent again. The nurse seemed more guarded this time. "Mrs. Brent, may I ask about the argument you had with Mr. Lonscombe?" Alice hesitated, then nodded. "It was about promises he made. He said he would protect Eliza, but something had changed. I feared for her safety. Did Geoffrey mention who threatened him?" "No, but there were visits. Late at night, strangers at the gate. He wouldn't say who they were." Miss Marple's mind pieced together the fragments. The missing secretary, the mysterious visitors, the threat of blackmail whispered in the village shop. The picture was far from clear, but the edges were beginning to sharpen. That evening, as the village settled beneath a star-strewn sky, Miss Marple sat in her favourite chair with a small notebook on her lap. She reviewed each conversation, each hint of fear and resentment. Her fingers traced the words she had written. Jealousy, betrayal, secrets, lies. She smiled softly to herself, knowing that in Lillingham, as in all places, the truth was a delicate thread, woven through a tapestry of human folly. It was her task to follow it, patiently and carefully, until the pattern revealed itself. For now she waited, for the next move, the next slip, the next word spoken too freely, and she would be ready. As dawn broke over Lillingham, casting a soft, pink glow over the village rooftops and dew-speckled gardens, the quiet morning carried with it a tension Miss Marple could almost taste. The past days had brought a slow but steady unravelling of the village's secrets, yet the core mystery, the why and the how of Geoffrey Lonscombe's untimely death, remained frustratingly elusive. It was precisely the sort of puzzle that thrived in small towns like this, where everyone knew everyone, but no one spoke plainly. Miss Marple sat at her usual spot by the window, a steaming cup of tea in hand, pondering the conversations she had gathered so far. The threads were tangled, but there was a pattern beneath the surface. Poison, secrecy, shifting alliances. Each detail seemed to point in several directions at once. She knew she needed to listen even more carefully to the village's whispers, not just the words, but the silences that followed. Her opportunity came sooner than expected. Mid-morning, as she wandered through the village green, she spotted a familiar figure standing outside the post office. Eliza Drake. The young woman was clutching a letter, her face pale, eyes darting nervously. Miss Marple approached with her characteristic gentle smile. "Eliza, dear," she said softly, "you look as though you've received some troubling news." Eliza startled slightly, but quickly composed herself. "Miss Marple, yes, it's from my solicitor in London. They found some papers among Geoffrey's effects. Letters, really, that suggest something quite serious." "May I see?" Miss Marple asked kindly. Eliza hesitated but handed over the envelope. Inside were several letters, typed and unsigned, but the contents unmistakable. Threats aimed at Geoffrey, warning him to halt some action or else face ruin. The language was veiled but unmistakably menacing. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she read one of the letters aloud. "If you proceed, all will be lost. Your secrets will see the light, and those you trust will turn away." Eliza's voice trembled. "He never showed me these. I only learned of them through the solicitor. Geoffrey must have been terrified." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully. Fear can be a powerful motivator for desperate acts. Eliza looked up, searching Miss Marple's face for answers. "Do you think someone wanted him dead?" "It appears so, but the question remains, who stands to gain the most, and who had the means to deliver such a subtle poison?" As they spoke, a familiar voice interrupted. "Eliza, there you are." It was Alice Brent appearing flushed from a brisk walk. Her eyes flicked suspiciously between the two women. Eliza's grip tightened on the letters. "Mrs. Brent, I was just showing Miss Marple some letters we found." Alice's face paled slightly, but she smiled quickly. "Such things can be misleading. We should be careful not to jump to conclusions." Miss Marple inclined her head, masking her keen observation. Alice's reaction, though brief, suggested she knew more than she admitted. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple sought out the village apothecary, Mr. Peveril. His shop was a cluttered haven of bottles, dried herbs, and obscure remedies. And he greeted her with cautious warmth. "Miss Marple, what a surprise. I hear troubling news has unsettled Lillingham." "Indeed, Mr. Peveril. I wonder if you might help me understand a little more about poisonings, particularly those that act slowly, almost imperceptibly." The apothecary stroked his chin thoughtfully. "There are a few such substances, none of which are easily obtained these days without raising suspicion. Yet in skilled hands even common remedies can be turned dangerous. Heavy metals, certain plant extracts, subtle but deadly. Would any of these be found in your shop?" "Most certainly. But I keep careful records, and no unusual purchases have been made recently. Still, access is not the only factor. Knowledge and opportunity are equally important." Miss Marple nodded, storing this knowledge away. "And what of Mrs. Holloway, Geoffrey's secretary? Have you heard anything of her?" Mr. Peveril looked uneasy. "No one has seen her for weeks. Some say she left suddenly after an argument with Geoffrey. Others believe she feared for her safety." That evening, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, her mind racing with possibilities. She spread out her notes, the missing secretary, the threatening letters, the suspicious behavior of Cecil Grange, and the veiled anxiety of Alice Brent. She realized now that the layers of the mystery extended beyond a simple murder. There were hidden relationships, long-standing grudges, and perhaps even blackmail. The poison was but a symptom of something deeper, a desperate attempt to protect secrets that could unravel lives. The next day, Miss Marple attended the village market, where gossip flowed as freely as the fresh produce. She listened carefully as villagers exchanged theories, some blaming Cecil's greed, others hinting at Eliza's sudden return as more than mere coincidence. In the midst of this, she noticed a subtle exchange between two men near the fishmonger's stall, furtive glances, lowered voices. One was a stranger to the village, introduced recently as a handyman hired to maintain some of the older homes. His name was Tom Halstead, and though unassuming, there was something about his manner that piqued Miss Marple's curiosity. Later, when the market buzz quieted, Miss Marple found a moment to speak to the village constable, a young man named Andrews, who had been assisting Inspector Cray. "Constable, have there been any reports of suspicious activity near the Lonscombe estate?" Andrews shook his head. "Nothing concrete. But there were rumours of late-night visits, footsteps on the gravel, lights flickering when the house should have been dark." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Curious how the quietest places often hide the loudest secrets. As the days wore on, Miss Marple's patient observations began to reveal a tapestry woven with small but telling inconsistencies. Cecil Granger's alibi, though supported by servants, left gaps in the late afternoon hours. Alice Brent's vigilance toward Eliza bordered on protectiveness, yet her own reaction suggested a deeper involvement. Eliza herself seemed torn between innocence and knowledge, her fear mingled with moments of quiet defiance. One evening, while walking back from the post office, Miss Marple encountered Eliza alone by the old churchyard, the shadows long, and the "Air crisp, Eliza," Miss Marple called gently. "May I join you?" Eliza nodded, and they strolled together among the ancient tombstones. "I can't help but feel that Geoffrey's death was only the beginning," Eliza confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "There are things I've learned. Things that frighten me. He spoke of betrayal from the closest of friends, but I don't know whom to trust." Miss Marple considered her carefully. "Trust, my dear, is a fragile thing, especially when money and secrets are involved. But remember, those who threaten often reveal more by what they try to hide." Eliza looked up at her, searching. "Do you think the killer is still among us?" Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "More than that, I believe the danger is far from over, and it will take all our wits to see the truth through." As they parted, the village clock struck 9, echoing through the stillness. Miss Marple returned to her cottage, resolved to watch, listen, and wait. The poison had done its silent work, but the echoes of its effects were only beginning to be heard, and in the quiet corners of Lillingham, the shadows lengthened, carrying secrets that would soon come to light. Miss Marple awoke before dawn, the grey light filtering softly through the curtains as she prepared for another day in the village that seemed to hold its breath beneath a heavy veil of unease. The more she thought of Geoffrey Lonscombe's death, the more the pieces resisted, fitting neatly together. Yet the puzzle was undeniably intricate, woven with strands of jealousy, secrecy, and deception, hallmarks of human frailty she had come to understand so well. She decided the time had come to revisit certain conversations, to press more gently, and observe with even keener eyes the subtle reactions that might betray hidden truths. The day's first call was to the home of Mrs. Holloway's sister, Mrs. Agnes Carmichael, who lived in a neat cottage on the outskirts of Lillingham. If the missing secretary could be found, or if her departure understood, it might shed crucial light on the unfolding mystery. Agnes greeted Miss Marple with a polite but guarded expression. "I'm afraid I don't know much, Miss Marple. Elsie left suddenly, yes, but she was always a private woman. She said little about her work or the Lonscombe household. I only know she was upset the last time I saw her." Miss Marple nodded, gently probing. "Upset how, exactly?" "Hard to say. She mentioned feeling watched, and once spoke of a disagreement with Mr. Lonscombe, but she wouldn't elaborate. Then one day she was simply gone." "That's troubling," Miss Marple said softly. "Did she leave a note, or any indication where she might have gone?" "No, nothing. Only that she feared something was very wrong. I fear she may have been in danger herself." As Miss Marple left, her mind circled back to those words, Elsie feeling watched, the sense of threat. If Geoffrey's secretary had fled, it suggested that the danger extended beyond him, perhaps encompassing anyone close to his affairs. That danger was far from abstract. It was immediate and personal. Her next stop was the Lonscombe estate itself, where she requested to see Alice Brent once again. The nurse was at the garden gate, and upon seeing Miss Marple, her eyes reflected a complex blend of relief and apprehension. "Mrs. Brent," Miss Marple began, "you mentioned late visitors at the estate. Could you tell me more about them? Were they known to Mr. Lonscombe?" Alice hesitated, glancing around as if the very walls might be listening. "There were men I didn't recognize. They came in the evenings, spoke in low tones with Geoffrey. He seemed uneasy, but refused to say who they were." Miss Marple folded her hands calmly. "Do you think they might have threatened him?" Alice swallowed hard. "It's possible. Geoffrey was worried more than I had ever seen him before." "And you, Mrs. Brent, were you afraid for your own safety?" A flicker of pain crossed Alice's face. "I cared for Geoffrey, but I was powerless. I tried to protect Eliza too. But sometimes it felt like we were surrounded by shadows." "Shadows often conceal more than just darkness," Miss Marple said softly. "Thank you, Mrs. Brent." As she walked away, Miss Marple reflected on Alice's vulnerability and protective instincts. Could these feelings be genuine, or was there something else behind her guardedness? The line between truth and performance was often thin in Lillingham. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited the village pub, the King's Head, where gossip thrived alongside ale and hearty meals. The place was bustling with the usual crowd, but the atmosphere was heavier, marked by whispered speculations and sideways glances. She found herself drawn to a quiet corner where Tom Halstead, the handyman recently arrived in the village, sat nursing a pint. His presence intrigued her, not just because he was an outsider, but because of his careful observation of everyone else, like a man who measured his steps and words with care. "Mr. Halstead," Miss Marple began, sliding into the seat opposite him, "how have you found Lillingham since you arrived?" Tom smiled, a flash of something unreadable in his eyes. "It's peaceful mostly, but like any place it has its undercurrents." "Undercurrents that sometimes conceal trouble?" Miss Marple asked. He nodded slowly. "Yes. I keep my eyes open. You have to, in a place where everyone's watching." Have you noticed anything unusual recently? Anything that might be of interest to the local constable or Inspector Cray?" Tom hesitated, then leaned forward slightly. "There was a man who came around a few nights ago, asking questions about Geoffrey Lonscombe. I don't know his name, but he wasn't from around here." Miss Marple's curiosity piqued. "Did this man leave any clues?" "Only that he seemed desperate, angry too, like he was hunting for something or someone." "Thank you, Tom. Sometimes the smallest detail can be the key to unlocking the whole." Before she left the pub, Miss Marple caught sight of Cecil Grange speaking quietly with the landlord. The former heir looked tense, shoulders squared as if bracing for a storm. Their conversation ended abruptly as Cecil spotted Miss Marple and slipped out the door before she could approach. The day's final appointment was with Inspector Cray, who had shown an eagerness to close the case but also a streak of pragmatism. He greeted her briskly at the police station. "Miss Marple, you seem to have a keen interest in this matter," he said. "Indeed, Inspector. The villagers' fears and their stories hold many clues that a brief police investigation might overlook. Cecil Grange is still the prime suspect, but I admit some of the evidence is circumstantial. What do you make of it?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Sometimes the obvious suspect is a red herring, Inspector. It's the small, overlooked details that often reveal the truth, such as the missing secretary, for one. Her disappearance is not a coincidence. Then there are the threatening letters found by Eliza and the mysterious visitors at the estate." Cray rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "I've also received reports of some tension between Cecil and a stranger from East Melford. Possibly the handyman you mentioned." "Tom Halstead," Miss Marple confirmed. "A man who seems more perceptive than most realize." Cray sighed. "I fear this case is more complex than any of us imagined." "Complexity is the hallmark of human affairs," Miss Marple said softly. "But it is solvable, given patience and attention." As she left the station, dusk was settling over Lillingham, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. The village seemed to hold its breath again, waiting for the next secret to reveal itself. Walking home, Miss Marple considered her next step carefully. The threads were numerous, and her task was to untangle them one by one with gentle persistence. The shadows lengthened, and in the quiet corners of the village, eyes watched and waited, some with fear, others with intent. Miss Marple was certain of one thing. The truth was closer than anyone yet realized, and soon the delicate web of lies and half-truths would begin to unravel. The early morning mist clung low over Lillingham as Miss Marple stepped carefully along the worn stone path, leading to the Lonscombe estate. The air was thick with the faint scent of damp earth and fallen leaves, the village slowly waking beneath the soft light of dawn. It was the kind of morning that encouraged quiet thought, and Miss Marple had plenty of that as she approached the wrought iron gates, now ajar as if inviting her in. She had decided to visit the house once more, prompted by a restless feeling that something had been overlooked. The unsettling news about Elsie Holloway's sudden disappearance gnawed at her mind. A missing person was often a thread, fragile yet vital, in the tapestry of a mystery. If Elsie had fled for fear of her life, then the danger was far from over, and the shadows that clung to Geoffrey Lonscombe's death still had darker depths. The house seemed strangely silent, the usual bustle of staff absent. Miss Marple noted the closed windows and the drawn curtains, which lent an air of abandonment at odds with the estate's grandeur. As she stepped into the dim hallway, a faint creak underfoot startled her, a reminder that the house, too, held secrets in its very structure. Suddenly, footsteps echoed from above, a light, hurried sound. Miss Marple's sharp ears caught it immediately, and she followed the sound toward the servants' quarters. There, to her surprise, she found Eliza Drake seated on a worn chair, her face pale but her eyes alert. "Eliza," Miss Marple greeted gently. "I was hoping to find you here." Eliza started, but then managed a small, weary smile. "Miss Marple, I didn't expect to see you. I understand you've had a difficult time. Might I ask why you've returned so quietly?" Eliza's eyes flickered with a mixture of fear and determination. "I had to come back. There are things I need to tell you, things I was too afraid to say before." Miss Marple settled beside her. "You're safe here. Please tell me everything." Taking a deep breath, Eliza began to recount the last weeks. Geoffrey Lonscombe had confided in her that his past was catching up with him. He feared for his life after receiving those threatening letters. But more than that, he had discovered something about his own family that would shatter reputations and expose long-buried betrayals. He had intended to confront Cecil Grange about it, but someone else got there first. "Did he say who?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Eliza hesitated, then shook her head. "No, he was too frightened. But I know one thing. Cecil was not the only one involved." Miss Marple's mind turned swiftly to Alice Brent and Tom Halstead. Both had acted with subtle urgency in recent days. The villagers' tension seemed less like random discord and more like a carefully orchestrated dance to keep secrets hidden. "Was Elsie ever threatened directly?" Miss Marple inquired. "Yes," Eliza whispered. "After Geoffrey's death I received a warning too. Not in writing, but a visit, a shadow watching from the edge of the garden. I thought it was just nerves, but now I'm sure it was something worse." Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "We must be cautious, Eliza, but your courage in coming forward is invaluable." They spoke long into the morning, and as Eliza recounted more details, Miss Marple's understanding deepened. The web of motives was wider than she had anticipated. There was a rivalry not only for the estate, but also for secrets best kept buried. Later that day, Miss Marple returned to the village, where she arranged to meet Inspector Cray once again. The inspector, though polite, showed signs of frustration. His efforts to pin the crime on Cecil Grange had met with resistance, and the sudden reappearance of Eliza complicated matters further. "Miss Marple, your insights have been most helpful," Cray began, "but I'm afraid the official evidence is still circumstantial. We need something more concrete." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Inspector, sometimes what is most concrete is not a physical object, but the response it provokes in the guilty. I propose a test, an encounter designed to reveal the killer's true colors." Cray's eyes sharpened with interest. "Go on." "There is a certain tension between several suspects. If we arrange a gathering under the guise of a memorial for Geoffrey, I believe observing their interactions and reactions will tell us much. The culprit will not be able to mask their unease." Cray considered this. "A reunion of sorts. It's unconventional, but it might just work." Miss Marple smiled, a faint glimmer of anticipation in her eyes. "It will require patience and subtlety, but I have faith in human nature's tendency to betray itself under pressure." The plan was set. Invitations were sent discreetly, under the pretense of a small commemoration to honor Geoffrey's memory and to allow the villagers to come together and heal. The date was fixed for the following Saturday evening. the village hall to be the venue. As the week progressed, whispers of the gathering spread, stirring a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Miss Marple continued her quiet observations, noting small changes in demeanour, Cecil's forced joviality, Alice's distracted glances, Tom's guarded presence, and Eliza's growing resolve. The day of the gathering arrived, and Miss Marple arrived early to prepare the space. The hall was modestly decorated, the scent of fresh flowers mingling with the warmth of the flickering candles. She positioned herself near the entrance, watching as villagers arrived, their faces masks of politeness concealing myriad emotions. The meeting began with tentative conversation, memories of Geoffrey shared with cautious tenderness. Yet beneath the surface, the atmosphere crackled with unspoken tension. Miss Marple's eyes observed closely as she noted who sought whom out, who avoided eye contact, and who appeared restless. It was in these small gestures, the tightening of a jaw, a fleeting glare, a nervous hand, that the truth waited patiently to be uncovered. As the evening wore on, the subtle psychological game Miss Marple had anticipated began to unfold. Under her quiet gaze, the cracks in the facades widened, and the web of deception slowly began to unravel. The village hall was softly lit by candles, flickering in sconces along the walls, casting gentle shadows that danced as the evening breeze stirred the curtains. The air held a curious mixture of solemnity and unease, like the hush before a storm. Miss Marple, seated quietly near the back, observed the gathering with a calmness born from years of understanding the intricate dance of human nature. The guests spoke in hushed tones at first, recalling stories of Geoffrey Lonscombe with a blend of affection and regret. Yet beneath the surface, Miss Marple detected the slightest tremors of tension, barely perceptible shifts in posture, or quick exchanges of glances that betrayed deeper currents of anxiety. Cecil Grange arrived just after the start, his usually confident demeanour somewhat frayed.
He exchanged stiff greetings and moved to the far side of the room, avoiding direct contact with the others. Alice Brent, nursing a cup of tea, sat close to Eliza Drake, whose pale face was more composed than Miss Marple had seen it in days. Tom
Halstead lingered near the entrance, his eyes scanning the room like a watchful sentinel. Miss Marple suspected he was less a visitor than a guardian of secrets, carefully weighing every word and gesture. As the evening progressed, Miss Marple initiated a conversation with Mrs. Carmichael, the sister of Elsie Holloway. The two women exchanged pleasantries, but Miss Marple gently steered the discussion toward Elsie's sudden disappearance. Agnes's lips tightened as she recounted the last days before Elsie vanished, emphasizing the fear that had settled over her sister. She was convinced someone was watching her, Agnes said softly, her eyes clouded with worry. And that she had to leave or face danger. Miss Marple nodded knowingly. Fear often sharpens the senses, Mrs. Carmichael, though it can also cloud judgment. But it is certainly a sign that something was amiss. At that moment, a quiet murmur rippled through the room. Miss Marple turned to see Inspector Cray approaching Cecil Grange, who straightened abruptly, his gaze narrowing slightly. The inspector spoke in a low voice, and for a moment the tension between them was almost tangible. Miss Marple's attention shifted back to the other guests, noting the subtle signs of unease. Alice Brent's fingers trembled slightly as she lifted her cup, and Eliza's eyes darted nervously toward the doorway. It was then that Miss Marple observed something curious. Tom Halstead's steady gaze fixed on a particular corner where a folded piece of paper rested unnoticed on a chair. The paper seemed out of place, almost deliberately left behind. Curiosity piqued, Miss Marple excused herself and quietly approached the chair. The note was brief, written in a hurried scrawl. Meet me at the old mill tonight. It's time the truth is known. The note was unsigned, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Elsie Holloway's. Returning to the group, Miss Marple weighed her next move carefully. The invitation was clearly a challenge, a desperate attempt by Elsie to reveal what she knew before it was too late. She shared the discovery with Inspector Cray in a hushed aside, and together they agreed to investigate the mill at once, hoping to find Elsie or some clue to her whereabouts. As they prepared to leave, the gathering's atmosphere thickened, the villagers' uneasy glances betraying the growing fear that secrets long buried might soon surface. The drive to the old mill was quiet except for the crunch of gravel under the car's tires. The mill, long abandoned and half swallowed by ivy and shadows, loomed like a relic of forgotten times. Miss Marple led the way inside, her eyes adjusting to the gloom. The air smelled of dust and damp wood, the silence punctuated only by distant dripping water. It was there, in the faint light filtering through broken windows, that they found signs of recent activity. Footprints in the dust, a hastily discarded scarf caught on a nail. Suddenly a faint sound echoed from the shadows, a whispered plea, urgent and fearful. "Elsie!" Miss Marple called softly. From behind a stack of crates emerged a figure, trembling but alive. It was Elsie Holloway, her face pale but determined. She clutched a small bundle close to her chest. "I had to hide," she whispered. "They were looking for me. After Geoffrey's death, I knew I was next." Miss Marple gently took the bundle, unwrapping it to reveal a collection of letters, photographs, and a worn diary, evidence that promised to unravel the tangled threads of deceit. Elsie's voice grew stronger as she recounted the final days. Geoffrey had uncovered a secret about his family's past, involving deceit, betrayal, and a claim to the estate that threatened to ruin several reputations. The letters, Elsie explained, were warnings. Not just to Geoffrey, but to me. As well, someone wanted to keep the truth buried. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "And who, Elsie? Who stands to lose the most from these revelations?" Elsie hesitated, then whispered a name that sent a chill through the room. Someone they had all believed innocent, yet whose carefully maintained facade was beginning to crumble. As dawn approached, the group emerged from the mill, the weight of newfound knowledge pressing upon them. The game was changing, and the shadows that had long protected the truth were thinning. Miss Marple knew the next steps would be delicate and dangerous, requiring patience, wit, and the subtlety that had always been her greatest weapon. The true test was yet to come. The soft hues of dawn stretched over Lillingham as Miss Marple and Inspector Cray led Elsie Holloway away from the crumbling mill. The weight of the revelations gathered within her trembling hands. The village, still asleep beneath the pale morning light, seemed unaware that beneath its quiet surface a secret storm was about to break. Back in the village hall, the room where the commemorative gathering had unfolded hours earlier, now felt charged with an unseen electricity. Miss Marple placed Elsie's bundle carefully on the polished oak table. The letters, photographs, and diary pages were spread out like pieces of a fractured mirror, each shard reflecting a fragment of the truth they sought to restore. Miss Marple's keen eyes scanned the letters first, the paper worn but the ink still legible. They were addressed to Geoffrey from an anonymous correspondent, their tone veiled in threats, yet laced with intimate knowledge of the Lonscombe family's past. The photographs depicted old, faded faces, some unfamiliar, others bearing unsettling resemblance to the villagers now present, and the diary belonged unmistakably to Geoffrey, chronicling his unease, his fears, and most crucially, the discoveries that had haunted him. "It seems, Elsie," Miss Marple murmured, "that Geoffrey had uncovered a secret that someone in this village would kill to protect." Elsie nodded, her voice steady despite the exhaustion shadowing her features. He was going to confront Cecil Grange, but he never got the chance. After that, the threats stopped being letters and became actions. Inspector Cray stepped closer, his brows furrowed. "And the name you whispered at the mill. Who did Geoffrey suspect?" Elsie glanced around the room, her eyes lingering briefly on several faces before settling. "It's Alice Brent." The room fell into a hush. Alice, seated near the window, visibly stiffened, her hands tightening around her teacup. Her eyes flickered with a mixture of surprise and something darker, an almost imperceptible shadow of guilt or fear. Miss Marple observed quietly, aware that such revelations were like tinder in a dry woodpile. The delicate balance of trust and suspicion could ignite at any moment. "Miss Brent," Miss Marple said softly, "would you care to explain your connection to Geoffrey's discoveries?" Alice's composure returned, smooth and practiced. "I won't deny that Geoffrey's findings concerned me," she said evenly, "but I had no reason to harm him. Yes, I worried for my family's reputation, but murder, that is not in my nature." Eliza Drake, who had remained silent until now, spoke up. "There are more than reputations at stake, Miss Brent. There are livelihoods, inheritances, and long-held grudges. Fear makes people do desperate things." Alice's gaze hardened. "Fear, yes, but not desperation, and certainly not murder." Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Cecil Grange, who had remained mostly silent during the exchange, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Mr. Grange, you have had a complicated relationship with Geoffrey Lonscombe. Would you care to share your thoughts on this matter?" Cecil finally looked up, his expression weary. "I admit, Geoffrey and I disagreed often, especially about the estate. But I did not kill him. We all had secrets, yes, but murder was not among mine." Tom Halstead, who had until now been a quiet observer, cleared his throat. "Secrets, grudges, they're like weeds in a garden. You can't uproot one without disturbing the others. Someone wanted to protect something very fiercely." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed, Mr. Halstead, and it is our task to uncover which weed strangled the life from Geoffrey." The conversation grew more intense as accusations and denials wove through the room like a tangled thread. Yet amid the turmoil, Miss Marple's mind was already tracing the patterns she had observed since the funeral, the subtle behaviors, the hidden fears, the carefully concealed alliances. Then something unexpected occurred. The door to the hall creaked open, and a messenger arrived breathless with news that sent a fresh ripple of shock through the group. It was the village doctor, who had found a body near the edge of the woods. The body of a man known to be one of Geoffrey's oldest acquaintances, an outlier who had lived on the fringes of Lillingham society. The man's death, by all appearances, was violent. The doctor suspected foul play. Miss Marple felt the familiar tightening of suspense coil within her. The death was not just another tragedy. It was a deliberate act designed to distract, to mislead, or perhaps to silence a witness. She exchanged a meaningful glance with Inspector Cray. The puzzle had deepened, and the stakes were higher than ever. The villagers, already on edge, whispered anxiously. Miss Marple saw the flicker of fear in Alice's eyes once more, the rigid set of Cecil's jaw, and the tense posture of Tom. Elsie, too, seemed shaken, but resolute. "The secret," she said quietly, "is bigger than any one of us." Miss Marple understood then that the mystery was no longer confined to Geoffrey's death alone. It was a tangled skein of lies and truths that extended far beyond the estate's boundaries. That evening, as the villagers dispersed with uneasy glances over their shoulders, Miss Marple remained behind, her mind a whirl of deduction and quiet determination. She understood that the final test was close at hand, the moment when the carefully constructed masks would slip, and the truth would emerge from the shadows. She would need to orchestrate a confrontation that forced the guilty party to reveal themselves not through force or accusation, but through the subtle art of human psychology, the very tool Miss Marple had wielded with such success for years. In the soft glow of the fading day, she began to plan, confident that patience, observation, and a gentle but unyielding pressure would bring justice to Lillingham at last. Miss Marple rose early the next morning, the quiet of the village just beginning to stir as she prepared for the delicate work ahead. The previous day's revelations had unsettled Lillingham, and the sense of watchfulness lingered like a mist over the narrow streets and quaint cottages. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of dew and blooming hedgerows, yet beneath this calm surface lay a restless tension that Miss Marple could feel in every glance and whispered conversation. Her plan was simple, yet precise: to draw the culprit out by arranging a gathering under the guise of a tea party at her cottage. It was a setting familiar and comfortable to all, but one where subtle provocations could be introduced and reactions observed without suspicion. She sent invitations that morning to Cecil Grange, Alice Brent, Tom Halstead, Elsie Holloway, Eliza Drake, and of course Inspector Cray. As the guests arrived, Miss Marple welcomed each with her characteristic warmth, masking the keen watchfulness behind her gentle smile. The room filled with polite greetings and the clinking of teacups, but beneath the civility, the undercurrents of fear and suspicion rippled faintly. Miss Marple began with casual remarks about the estate and the recent tragedies, weaving her words to provoke thought without accusation. She spoke of trust, secrets, and the peculiar way fear can twist even the closest relationships. Her voice was soft, almost conversational, but every sentence was crafted to set a trap. Alice Brent was the first to show signs of discomfort. Her fingers tightened around her teacup, and her eyes flickered to the window, as if searching for an escape. Miss Marple noted this quietly, making a mental note of the slight blush that coloured her cheeks. Cecil Grange, ever the stoic, kept his gaze fixed on his plate, but there was a tension in his jaw that suggested unease. Tom Halstead sat back with a calculating look, observing the room like a general surveying a battlefield. Elsie, still fragile from her ordeal, clung to the hope that truth would finally bring peace. Miss Marple shifted the conversation toward Geoffrey's diary, recounting excerpts that hinted at betrayals and threats. She mentioned the anonymous letters, the secret meetings, and the dangerous knowledge that had sealed his fate. As the discussion deepened, Miss Marple introduced a subtle yet pivotal detail, the mention of a certain family heirloom, one that had vanished shortly before Geoffrey's death. The heirloom, a small but valuable pendant, was said to carry more than sentimental value. It was a symbol of a hidden legacy that some would kill to claim or conceal. At the mere mention, Alice's composure faltered momentarily, a shadow crossing her face before she masked it with a polite sip of tea. Cecil's eyes sharpened, and even Tom's impassive mask showed a flicker of interest. Miss Marple observed these reactions carefully, her mind piecing together the puzzle from these delicate clues. She then shifted focus to the newly discovered body found near the woods, speculating gently on the man's connection to Geoffrey and the broader conspiracy. Throughout the gathering, Miss Marple encouraged dialogue, subtly questioning and guiding, allowing each guest to reveal fragments of their own stories and motives. The villagers' facades began to crack, small slips betraying secrets long held beneath polite smiles. Later, when the conversation turned to the night of the funeral and the mysterious circumstances surrounding Geoffrey's death, a subtle tension filled the room. Miss Marple mentioned how some had noted unusual behavior, unexplained absences and strange meetings that evening. Tom Halstead shifted uncomfortably, and Alice's hands clenched tightly in her lap. Cecil's posture straightened, and Elsie's eyes welled with tears as memories surfaced. Miss Marple leaned in slightly, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying unmistakable weight. Sometimes the most telling truths come not from what is said, but from what is left unsaid. Her words hung in the air like a challenge. As the afternoon waned into evening, Miss Marple gently proposed a game of recollection, a shared retelling of the funeral day, asking each guest to recount their movements and observations. This exercise was designed to reveal inconsistencies and provoke reactions. Alice was the first to speak, describing her attendance at the church and a brief conversation with Geoffrey before the ceremony. Cecil followed, mentioning his late arrival, due to a meeting in town. Tom's account was less precise, his gaze occasionally darting toward Alice and Cecil. Elsie spoke softly of her distress and the feeling of being watched. Eliza's recollections were brief and cautious. When it was Miss Marple's turn to speak, she summarized the events with a practiced subtlety, highlighting moments that others had overlooked: a shadow seen near the chapel, a whispered conversation, interrupted, a glance exchanged that carried a weight of unspoken understanding. Throughout the retellings, Miss Marple watched Alice most closely. When a slip of the tongue revealed a detail inconsistent with earlier statements, a faint flicker of panic crossed her features before she recovered. At last, Miss Marple's eyes met Alice's with a steady, gentle intensity. "Miss Brent," she said quietly, "sometimes the burden of secrecy grows too heavy, and in trying to protect what we cherish, we lose sight of the cost." Alice's mask cracked, and for a moment, vulnerability seeped through. She looked away, then back, her voice barely audible. "I never meant for any of this to happen. Geoffrey threatened to destroy everything. I had to protect my family." The room held its breath. Miss Marple continued softly. "The letters, the threats, the missing heirloom, all part of a web spun to conceal a painful truth. But murder is a harsh severing of ties." Alice's hands trembled as she confessed to a confrontation with Geoffrey at the funeral, an argument that escalated beyond her control. The struggle, the accidental death, it was not premeditated. but the panic that followed had led her down a dark path. Inspector Cray moved forward to take Alice into custody, his expression a mixture of relief and gravity. As the guests dispersed, the weight of resolution settled over the room, tempered by the sorrow of lost innocence and shattered trust. Miss Marple remained seated a moment longer, reflecting on the fragile nature of human hearts and the quiet devastation wrought by fear and desperation. The village of Lillingham would awaken to a new day, scarred perhaps, but free from the shadows that had haunted it. And as the sun rose higher, Miss Marple, ever composed and quietly resolute, prepared to return to the steady rhythms of village life, knowing well that beneath its peaceful surface, human nature would continue to weave mysteries for those patient enough to listen. As the late afternoon sun cast long, gentle shadows across the village green, Miss Marple sat quietly in her favourite armchair by the window of her cosy sitting room, a steaming cup of tea resting untouched on the small table beside her. The tumult of the past days had slowly settled, leaving behind a fragile peace in Lillingham, though the echoes of sorrow and betrayal still lingered in the air. Inspector Cray had departed earlier, escorting Alice Brent to the station with a measured kindness, aware that the truth, while painful, was the only path to healing. The village, though shaken, began to stir back to life, shops reopening, children's laughter tentatively returning, and the familiar rhythms of daily routine resuming their gentle cadence. Yet Miss Marple's mind remained active, piecing together the final threads of this intricate tapestry of secrets. It had been Alice's subtle gestures, the inconsistencies in her recounting, and the silent weight of her fears that had first caught Miss Marple's discerning eye. But it was more than just the evidence, it was the understanding of human nature, the recognition that beneath the genteel facades lay fierce protectiveness, fragile pride, and desperate hope. She recalled the missing heirloom, the pendant, whose disappearance had seemed trivial to most, yet had proven to be a symbol far greater than mere ornamentation. It was a tangible reminder of the Lonscombe family's hidden history, a legacy Alice had fought to protect at any cost. The anonymous letters had been warnings and threats, but also cries for help and veiled admissions of guilt. Miss Marple smiled faintly, thinking of Geoffrey, whose curiosity and courage had both illuminated and endangered the fragile peace of Lillingham. His diary had been the key, its pages filled with careful observations, personal fears, and subtle clues missed by others. It was a testament to his resolve and the tragic consequence of his pursuit of truth. As the village slowly healed, Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing justice had been served, not through loud accusation or dramatic confrontation, but through patient observation and gentle understanding. The complexity of human motives, the fragile webs of relationships, and the quiet power of empathy had revealed the truth in a way only she could discern. The sun dipped lower, bathing the room in warm amber light, and Miss Marple sipped her tea at last. Outside, the village continued its quiet dance of life, its secrets laid bare, but its spirit unbroken. And somewhere beyond the calm streets and blooming gardens, the subtle mysteries of human nature waited patiently, ready to be unravelled, again by a kindly watchful eye.